Hey guys, tonight we slip out of your normal comfy world and step into a foggy London street where the air tastes like cold smoke and damp stone. You stand just far enough from the gutter to avoid whatever that is trickling past your boots, but close enough to feel the cold mist prickle your cheeks. Ahead of you rises the lump of Newgate Prison, its walls thick, brooding and stained darker near the ground where decades of filth and rain have worked their way into the stone. Lantern light flickers on iron bars, and the whole place seems to lean over you like it is deciding whether to swallow you up. Somewhere inside, metal scrapes against metal, and you get that little shiver that says in a very honest voice, you probably will not survive this in one piece if it were real. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there, because right now in your imagination, it is a late Victorian evening, and the city feels very awake. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in front of Newgate, and the first thing that hits you is the size. These walls have seen centuries of fear. The original prison went up in the 12th century, and by the Victorian era, it has been rebuilt, reinforced, and expanded so many times that it feels less like a building and more like layers of punishment stacked on top of each other. Massive blocks of stone form an almost windowless face on the street, broken only by narrow slits and the heavy gate that gives the place its name. The air is colder here, not because of the weather, but because everyone who passes knows exactly what this building means. To your left, the bustle of London carries on. You can hear the clatter of carriage wheels on the cobbles, the calls of street, cellars, maybe even the faint melody of someone trying to make a living with a cheap fiddle. Newgate sits only a short walk from the Old Bailey, the famous criminal court where people are tried. That is part of its power. One side of the street decides your guilt. The other side locks you away or kills you for it. One convenient little justice package. Nothing like efficiency when human lives are on the line, right? The smell is its own character. Coal smoke from thousands of fireplaces rolls through, mixed with the sharp stink of the nearby meat market at Smithfield, where animals are slaughtered, chopped, and sold. On damp days, the odor seems to cling to the stone of the prison itself, as if every brick has soaked up blood, soot, and cheap gin fumes. There are stories that people could find their way to Newgate just by following their nose on foggy nights, which is both impressive and deeply unfortunate. You notice people slowing their steps as they pass. No one wants to look like they are staring, but almost everyone sneaks a glance at the walls, the barred windows, the heavy doors. Newgate is not just a building, it is a warning sign built in stone. In Victorian London, crime is always in the newspapers. Reporters love a dramatic trial. A Newgate gives them a stage. When someone famous or infamous is locked up in here, crowds will gather outside just to say they stood near the same wall. A strange sort of sightseeing. Your modern brain might think of it as the grim Victorian version of taking a selfie outside a notorious location, except with more cholera and fewer filters. A watchman at the gate eyes you as if he is measuring your clothes and your nerves. The uniforms of the warders look dark and practical, designed to blend into the gloom. You might notice a small crest or badge. Something that says, "This is all perfectly official." Behind them, through a gap in the gate, you glimpse a short inner yard lit by yellow lamps, and behind that another door. The prison does not let you step straight from street to cells. It draws you in one barrier at a time, like a mouth with several rows of teeth. Victorian reformers claim that prisons like Newgate exist to correct people, not only to punish them. They talk about discipline, hard work, and moral improvement. On paper, that sounds almost wholesome. In stone and iron, it feels different. You can sense how easily ideas about reform become excuses for cruelty when nobody outside gets to see the details. Historians still argue whether Newgate, in this period, is truly shifting toward rehabilitation or just dressing up old brutality in fancy new words like separate system and moral training. You shift your weight and glance at the upper walls. Somewhere up there in small high windows you can imagine the eyes of prisoners looking down, hoping for a glimpse of sky, a face they know, or simply anything that is not the same four walls. In reality, many will not see much of the outside world at all. Risky prisoners are confined, sometimes in near darkness, their contact with others carefully regulated. That is the theory. In practice, human beings are noisy, emotional creatures. Voices carry through stone, footsteps echo, keys rattle, and secrets travel, faster than the waters would like. A cart rattles past, its wheels splashing, through a shallow puddle. It is covered with a tarp, and you feel that instinctive curiosity flare up. There are stories of bodies being taken out of Newgate in carts, sometimes to be buried, sometimes to be dissected by medical students at the hospital. The law allows the bodies of executed criminals to be used for anatomy lessons. A free cadaver is a free cadaver. Apparently, it is a grim but very practical example of how Victorian society likes to squeeze every last use out of a person, even after the rope has done its work. A lamp near the gate hisses, lit by gas. The light is harsh, making the stone look almost oily. You think of all the people who have stood here in real life, hearts pounding, waiting to be taken inside. Some have been accused of theft, some of violent crime, some of forgery, and some are simply too poor to pay their debts. Not everyone who enters has been convicted, yet. Newgate is a holding place as much as it is a destination. For many, this is the first point where hope starts to feel thin. You draw in another breath of smoky, chilly air and look up one more time. Somewhere beyond those walls, people eat, sleep, pray, cry, bargain, and sometimes die. Out here, you stand in safety, but your imagination is already slipping under the archway through the heavy doors into the echoing dark. You are noticing how your shoulders tighten, how your mind starts lining up questions it is not sure it wants answered. The city noise swells and fades around you. A street seller shouts something about hot potatoes. A child laughs too loudly for this location. Your eyes go back to the gate as if pulled by gravity. No more hovering at the edge. If you want to know what really happens inside Newgate Prison in Victorian London, you are going to have to pass through those doors and let the stone close behind you. You let your attention slide away from the prison walls and into the streets that feed people toward them. The city stretches in every direction, crowded and restless, like a living machine that never really switches off. Chimneys spit smoke into a sky the color of dishwater. The sound of wheels, hooves, and hurried footsteps blends into a constant background rumble. Victorian London is not just big, it is booming, swollen with PE. Opal, arriving from the countryside, from Ireland, from across the empire, all looking for work and ending up in whatever corner will take them. You drift along a narrow lane, careful where you place your feet. Gas lamps glow above you, turning the mist into a soft haze. In doorways you see figures huddled in rough coats, wrapped in shawls, or just curled against the stone in their shirts, trying to sleep sitting up. Some are children. They look too small for a city that feels this sharp around the edges. In this world, people talk about the dangerous classes, as if poverty itself is a crime. The British government has passed a steady stream of laws to deal with theft, robbery, and violence, and Newgate Prison stands ready as the place where many of those stories end. That much is a well-known fact of the period. As you turn into a busier street, the mood changes from hushed to loud. Market stalls overflow with cabbage leaves, fish on beds of melting ice, cheap ribbons, and piles of second-hand clothes. The sharp smell of onions and old fish tries to fight with coal, smoke, and horse dung. A costermonger selling fruit from a barrow shouts out his prices with the enthusiasm of someone who knows that noise is a kind of advertising. You notice how many hands are out, how many pockets gape just slightly open, how many eyes flick from purse to distraction to exit. Pickpockets thrive. In crowds like these, your own hand probably drifts toward where you imagine your wallet would be. Good instinct. The police in their dark uniforms patrol through batons hanging at their sides. They are a relatively new feature in city life, a regular force rather than the old chaotic system of watchmen and informers. Some passers-by nod respectfully. Others keep a careful distance, especially if their work slides a bit too close to the line of legality. Historians still argue whether the RI's E in printed crime reports reflects an actual increase in criminal behavior or simply more people noticing and recording what has always been there. You stop near a newsstand. Sheets of paper hang from strings like a forest of rectangles, printing ink still smelling sharp. Headlines shout about murder, poisoning, fraud, daring robberies, scandals in high society, and dramatic trials at the criminal courts. Names of defendants are printed in bold as if they are celebrities. Some of them are on their way to Newgate or already inside waiting for sentence. You can feel the tug this sort of news has. It promises shock, outrage, and just enough moral judgment that readers can say they are learning a lesson, not simply enjoying the drama. On a small side table you spot something more lurid. Cheap illustrated. Sheets show crude drawings of crime scenes, grim expressions, and dramatic moments in the courtroom. These are sold for a penny or a halfpenny, so even very poor people can buy them. Stories about criminals become entertainment. You can almost imagine someone reading one aloud by the light of a single candle in a crowded room, pausing at the cliffhanger and milking the suspense. One quirky detail from this world is how some of these prints called broadsides are sold right up to the time of an execution, complete with verses about the condemned and a supposed last speech. People keep them like souvenirs, which is equal parts fascinating and unsettling. You walk on, stepping past a group of boys playing some chaotic game that involves a ball, a bit of rope, and rules that change every 10 seconds. Their clothes are patched, but their energy is fierce. In every group like this, one kid watches more carefully than he plays. He is already learning which pockets jingle with coins and how to vanish when a constable appears. Later writers call such children street Arabs or goo. Children and their presence sparks debates in Parliament and the press. Are these kids victims, future criminals, or both at once? For many respectable families, crime is something that happens to other people. They lock their doors, hire servants, and complain about the state of the streets while they sip tea. Yet those same families might send someone out to buy every issue of a sensational trial report. A famous example is the public obsession with the so-called Newgate calendar, a longing collection of stories about criminals, their misdeeds, and their supposed repentance. It started earlier than the Victorian era, but remains popular, feeding people a mix of horror and moralizing. You can see how Newgate Prison transforms into more than a building. It becomes a symbol, a brand, almost printed on the mind of anyone who cares about crime stories. As you curve back toward the area near the prison, you notice the buildings overlooking certain streets. Some have windows that command a perfect view of where a scaffold might be raised. People rent these rooms when an execution is scheduled, paying good money for a better sightline. It is a strange kind of ticketed event. Vendors wheel in carts stacked with food, drink, and those printed broadsides. Hawkers shout about the fate of the condemned in tones that would suit a circus. The mix of piety and spectacle is intense. Parents even bring their children, hoping the sight will scare them into good behavior. That is one version of Victorian family values for you. Writers and social commentators argue in newspapers about whether such public punishments keep people honest or actually encourage more brutality. Historians still argue whether the crowds at executions feel genuine horror or treat it mainly as a day out with added moral window dressing. Whatever the truth, the effect is clear. Every time a neck snaps the end of a rope in front of thousands of eyes, the reputation of Newgate grows. You pause at a bookstore and let your gaze run over titles. Some are religious tracts, urging people to repent and shun sin. Others are gripping narratives about daring highwaymen, elegant swindlers, and tragic murderesses. Critics coin the term Newgate novels for fiction that romanticizes criminals and uses the prison as a backdrop, authors find themselves accused of glorifying vice and turning real suffering into glamorous storytelling. In a way, you are caught in the same odd tension now listening in on this story. You want to know what really goes on behind the walls, but you also know that real lives, real fear, and real misery sit underneath every dramatic detail. The deeper you pay attention, the clearer the pattern becomes. Poverty, overcrowding, and lack of opportunity push thousands into desperate choices. The city grows faster than its ability to house and feed people decently. Meanwhile, newspapers, pamphlets, and novels turn crime into a narrative you can buy for a penny. Newgate stands in the middle of all this as both a practical institution and a symbol. It is supposed to protect society and scare people straight. At the same time, it feeds the public imagination, giving journalists, moralists, and gossip mongers a shared reference point. You take a slow breath and listen to the layered sounds of the streets, the cries of sellers, the clip of hooves, a distant church bell marking the hour. Somewhere close by, inside the thick walls you cannot see into right now, someone is counting those same chimes on iron fingers, wondering how many they have left until a verdict, a transfer, or the steps to the scaffold. Here in the restless heart of Victorian London, the city and the prison watch each other, tangled together in stone, ink, and human curiosity. You step under the stone archway and feel the city fall away behind you. The heavy gate closes with a thud that seems to seal the outside world on the other side. Ahead there is a short, dim passage where the air feels colder and thicker, as if it has decided to live here permanently. Lanterns give off a yellow glow, lighting flecks of dust that drift in front of your face. Your footsteps sound too loud on the worn stones, like you are walking across a drumhead. A ward waits in a small entrance room, coat buttoned tight, keys heavy on his belt. His eyes run over you with practiced speed, noting what you wear, how you stand, whether you look angry, frightened, or dangerous. There is no welcome. You are information to be processed and controlled. Newgate is officially a local prison that serves the city, taking in people accused and convicted of crimes. That is one of its basic roles in Victorian justice, and everyone in this room acts like they have rehearsed it 1,000 times. You are told to stand in a particular spot. Claire sits at a high desk, pen scratching in a large book. Ink stains his fingers. He asks your name, age, trade, the charge against you, and other details in a voice that sounds almost bored. This is the first layer of the prison hierarchy, written in neat columns. Once your details are in that book, you exist here, whether you like it or not. You might notice how the clerk looks slightly better fed than many of the people around. Paperwork is not glamorous, but it has its perks. A warder directs you deeper along a corridor that bends and narrows like a stone throat. The walls are damp in patches where moisture seeps through. You can smell old lime wash, the powdery chalk scent used in attempts to keep disease at bay. In some places you see tally marks scratched into the mortar, lines and crosses made by hands that needed to count something. Anything. The sound of keys ings out again as a door is opened ahead of you. You enter a small searching room where your belongings are examined. Pockets are turned out, seams checked. Anything sharp or suspicious is taken away. Coins, if you have them, might be noted and stored. Money matters in a place like this. It can mean better food, small comforts, access to tobacco or gin if you know the right people. One quirky detail whispered about Newgate is that certain warders quietly rent out extra blankets or small privileges to those who can pay. A side business that does not appear in the official regulations. A senior officer, sometimes called the chief warder, steps in to look you over. His manner is brisk. He explains the basic rules. There will be set times for rising, working, eating, and sleeping. Talking may be restricted or punished, depending on the system in use. Understanding the rules quickly is helpful for survival, at least if you prefer fewer visits to the punishment cells. You are given prison clothes, rough and shapeless, designed to make everyone look equally unimportant. Sliding into those garments feels like taking off your old life and hanging it on a peg you might never see again. As you move along another passage, you pass a doorway that leads toward the governor's quarters. Somewhere beyond, the governor works at a desk covered in reports, returns, and letters from authorities. The governor answers to the Home Office and to local magistrates expected to keep order and ensure regulations are followed, at least on paper. Historians still argue whether individual governors lean more towards strict punishment or practical leniency, and how much difference their personal character really makes in a complex institution like this. You are steered instead toward a small office where a chaplain waits in a black coat and white collar. His job is to watch over the spiritual state of the confined population and, importantly, to encourage repentance. He speaks to you in a serious tone about sin, forgiveness, and the chance to turn your life around. The words may be sincere or may roll out by habit. It is hard to tell. The chaplain is also expected to report on prisoners, moral improvement, and his opinion can carry weight when officials discuss someone's future. In some periods, chaplain become almost famous figures, publishing accounts of confessions, last speeches, and deathbed turnarounds. One odd detail that circulates outside the walls is the idea that such published narratives sometimes make the chaplain a minor celebrity, earning money and reputation from the drama of other people's endings. It turns a priest into something very close to a storyteller with Newgate as the constant background setting. You keep moving and step into a larger corridor that forms part of the main body of the prison. Doors line both sides, some solid wood, some with tiny inspection hatches. Iron bars guard stairways that lead up and down. Echoes are constant. A cough at one end, a muttered command at the other. All bounce around until the whole space feels like a giant ear that hears every small sound. Here, the hierarchy shifts. Warders watch prisoners. Younger or lower-ranked warders watch under officers. Turnkeys control access through each gate, quietly proud of their authority. Within the cells, another unofficial hierarchy grows. Older inmates or those with reputation may influence who sleeps where, who gets a spot near the ventilation grating, who shares smuggled tobacco. New arrivals, especially those who look nervous, are tested. People listen for accents that reveal where someone is from, trade, skills, or hints of connections outside. A former soldier, a skilled carpenter, or someone who can write a good petition might suddenly find themselves in demand. Survival here often depends on how fast you understand which alliances are safe and which will drag you down. As you pass a barred window that looks into a yard, you glimpse a circle of warders talking together. One gestures with a pipe. Another laughs at some joke you cannot hear. They share stories of attempted escapes, stupid schemes, and strange prisoners. These conversations form their own culture. A place like Newgate shapes the people who work here as much as those who are confined. Some officers become hardened, proud of being unshockable. Others drink more than they should once they are off duty. Some try to be quietly kind, slipping an extra crust of bread to a sick inmate or turning their eyes away from a minor rule break. You feel how the building wants to confuse your sense of direction. Corridors turn, steps rise unexpectedly. Doors lead into more doors. It is a maze designed not only to keep you inside, but to make sure you lose track of how the outside connects. If you had to retrace your route back to the main gate unaided, you would struggle. That is part of the power structure here. The people with keys know pathways you do not, and that knowledge keeps them in charge. At last, you are led toward the area where your cell will be. The worst keys clink with each step. Above you, stone arches carry the weight of floors crowded with other lives you cannot see yet. Somewhere nearby, a bell strikes and doors start to open and close in rhythm like a mechanical heartbeat. You are just one, more body in the system now, walking deeper into the maze, learning who holds power and how fragile your own choices have become in this carefully controlled world. The key turns, the lock clicks, and the door to the cell block swings, open with a creak that sounds like an old throat clearing. At once, the air wraps around you, thick and used, the breath of hundreds of peep, layered one on top of another. It smells of damp stone, sweat, old straw, cheap soap, and something sour underneath that you do not really want to identify. The corridor stretches ahead, lined with doors. each one a boundary around a small patch of space that someone has to call their world. You step in and feel. The floor flex slightly under your boots. Underneath are hollow spaces and drains, the hidden plumbing for a building that has to deal with human needs on a large scale. Victorian prison designers talk a lot about sanitation, ventilation, and morality, especially after reforms in the 1830 seconds and 1840 seconds try to standardize conditions. On paper, Newgate conforms to the idea that each prisoner should have a separate cell, a neat little human unit to be managed and improved. In reality, overcrowding turns that tidy vision into something messier. You look along the row of doors. Some have small barred grills at eye level, others small square flaps that can be lifted. At regular points, the corridor opens into a kind of central space where galleries rise one above another, like the layers of a narrow iron-fronted wedding cake. From here you can see 3, even 4 tiers of walkways with cells stacked up to the roof. A single skylight leaks pale, daylight down into the void, not nearly enough to chase away the shadows clinging to each corner. Your eyes adjust and details begin to pop out. There are numbers painted above each door, slightly crooked in places where the brush slipped. Whitewashed walls have faded chalk marks, smudges from hands and faint stains where water has seeped in. Long iron rails run along the galleries, cold and unforgiving. A water patrols slowly, boots striking the floor in a rhythm the prisoners learn without ever wanting to. The sound tells them when someone is coming, long before the person appears. A door nearby opens just wide enough for you to see inside. The cell is smaller than many modern bathrooms, barely long enough for a narrow bed, a stool, a small shelf, and a bucket. Light reaches in from a single window high in the wall, often only a small slit or grating. You can almost feel the strain in a prisoner's neck from craning to catch a glimpse of the sky through that rectangle. In some periods, the official rule is that each inmate sleeps alone in such a space, part of what reformers call the separate system. The idea is that isolation and reflection will inspire repentance, like a forced spiritual retreat, except with more rats and fewer cushions. Overcrowding ruins the plan. When numbers swell after harsh laws fill the prisons with thieves, debtors, and people convicted of minor offenses, 2 or even 3 bodies end up sharing a cell built for one. A mattress might be thrown onto the floor. The bucket becomes a central point of awkward negotiation. Privacy shrinks to the size of a turned back and a half-closed eye. Historians still argue whether the separate system ever truly functioned as intended in busy urban prisons, or whether it existed more as an ideal that reality politely ignored. Your nose finds new details. In some cells, the straw that covers the mattress has not been changed for too long. It carries the musty smell of damp, flattened. Stalks mixed with the sharp tang of old sweat. Fleas and lice thrive in such softness. You can imagine someone lying here, listening to the tiny tickle of insects on their skin, scratching until the itch burns, and knowing that complaining too often earns nothing but a shrug. One quirky detail that drifts through prisoner accounts is how some inmates learn to shake out their straw at a particular angle, claiming it makes the bugs roll to one side like crumbs being brushed from a table. Desperation breeds strange little technique. At CE. Arcane hours. Silence presses down. The silent system is another favored idea among reformers, insisting that prisoners should work and move without speaking in order to avoid bad influence and plot-making. Warders watch for lip movements and murmurs at mealtimes or during exercise. Some guards keep a sharp eye on any attempted conversation. Officially, silence is a moral tool, a way to force inward reflection. In practice, the human brain starts to fray when every instinct to talk is stamped on. You can picture a man mouth words to the wall just to hear the shape of them in his head, yet real silence never quite happens. You still hear coughs, shuffling feet, the scrape of a spoon on a tin plate, the occasional moan from someone who has forgotten to hold it in. Somewhere a bucket is dragged across stone, and Someone else mutters a quick curse before they remember that talking is risky. In the late evening, when lamps are turned down, strange sounds carry farther. A nervous laugh here, a sniffle, there the hollow boom of a door closed harder than usual. The building has its own language, and everyone in it learns the grammar whether they want to or not. You watch as prisoners are led along the gallery in single file. Some wear masks, or hoods that hide their faces, another peculiar feature of certain silent and separate regimes. Supposedly, this prevents them from recognizing each other later and forming criminal networks. From the outside, it gives the line of bodies a ghostly quality. They become shapes in rough fabric, emptied of identity. It is as if the system wants to erase not only what they did, but who they are. The smell from the privies and buckets creeps into everything despite attempts to keep it under control. Slops are carried along corridors at set times, a duty no one enjoys. Lime is scattered here and there in the hope it will kill smells and germs alike. Soap is issued but in small pieces. Washing takes place in shared facilities where the water cools quickly and privacy is minimal. Clothes hang from lines or hooks, sometimes drip-drying in the same air everyone is breathing. The result is a constant background scent of damp cloth twined with bodily odor. There is no way to step aside from it. When sickness strikes, the atmosphere becomes heavier still. A prisoner with a fever breathes out heat and dampness that make the air thicker in their cell and in the corridor outside. Windows are supposed to provide ventilation, but many are too small or clogged with grime to make much difference. Conversations in official reports speak confidently of improved drainage and ventilation schemes in the 19th century. Yet the reality that settles in your lungs here feels slow and stale. You imagine lying on a narrow bunk at night, the rough blanket pulled around your shoulders, listening to the snores and restless movements from neighboring cells. The walls feel both too close and too thin. On one side, another person shifts and mutters in their sleep. On the other, something tiny scratches in the skirting. Above, a ward's step moves, past at intervals, a reminder that you are never unobserved for long. Below, pipes and channels carry away waste and sometimes bring back smells that make you gag. Time stretches oddly inside a cell block like this. Days are marked by the opening and closing of doors, the clatter of meal tins, the shuffle to and from work or exercise yards. There is no quiet garden, no soft chair, no fresh breeze drifting in through wide-open windows. Does she express proper sorrow? Does he forgive the hangman? A good attitude might not save a life, but it can soften the report, win a kinder line in the official record. For the chaplain, a visibly penitent sinner becomes living proof that his work matters. For authorities, it allows the execution to be presented as a sad necessity framed by piety. You watch the chaplain place a hand on the prisoner's shoulder, eyes closed in prayer. The Bible lies open at a passage about thieves on a cross, or sinners welcomed at the last moment. The prisoner's fingers grip the pages so tightly the knuckles gleam white. Outside, the normal routines of the prison continue. Meals are cooked, labor is done, gossip is traded instead. There is regimented movement, strong smells, and the constant weight of enforced stillness. The cell door stands at your back in your imagination, as stubborn and unyielding as the stone. Every sense tells you that this is not simply a place to keep people safe from criminals. It is an experiment in controlling bodies and thoughts through space, smell, silence, and confinement. And you can feel its full pressure in every breath. A bell clangs, sharp and metallic, and the rhythm of the prison shifts. Doors open in a patterned sequence, boots scrape across the floor, and bodies start to move with that particular mix of reluctance and habit that comes from having almost no choice at all. You are herded along a corridor toward the smell of food. Though calling it a smell of food is generous, it is more like boiled starch, old tin, and a hint of despair, very light seasoning. You file into the area where meals are issued. In some parts of the prison, this is a long counter where waters stand behind heavy pots, ladles already sticky from use. In others, tins are passed along the corridor and shoved through hatches, but the basic idea is the same. A rigid standard diet is a cornerstone of Victorian prison life. Regulations lay out how many ounces of bread, how much GRL, how often you get a scrap of meat. It is meant to be enough to keep you alive and working, but not enough to feel comforting or indulgent. The phrase ply. N and wholesome appears often in official documents, which is a polite way of saying, you will be hungry again soon. A tin bowl is thrust into your hands. Inside sits a ladle of something that might be porridge or might simply be water with ambitions. Prison GRL is mostly oatmeal or barley, boiled in large quantities. Sometimes with a bit of milk, but often without. You raise it to your face and catch a faint smell of singed grain where the bottom of the pot caught on the heat. One mouthful confirms what your nose already suspects. It is lukewarm, bland, and carries the memory of every previous meal cooked in the same pot. On the bright side, you will spend almost no time agonizing over menu choices. Bread appears next, a thick slice cut from a rough loaf. It is dense, slightly underbaked in spots with the kind of texture that makes your jaw work hard. There may be potatoes on certain days, pale chunks that have surrendered any personality they once had. Meat is rare, often reserved for prisoners on hard labor or those judged to be weak. When it does appear, it is usually boiled, tough and stringy with fat that clings stubbornly to your teeth. One solid, historical fact is that Victorian prison diets are carefully measured in ounces and calories, long before most ordinary people ever see nutritional tables. The science does not stop the food from feeling depressing. You hear low mutters as other prisoners take their portions. Talking is technically restricted, but small comments slip out anyway. A joke about the meat being shy and hiding in the pot. A grumble about the bread being heavy enough to use as a weapon. Prison, humor works like a survival tool. If you can laugh at the lump in your bowl, you keep a small part of yourself from dissolving into the routine. A quirky detail that circulates in stories about places like this is the occasional appearance of foreign or experimental foods. There are tales of cheap cocoa or odd grain mixtures being tested on inmates before being rolled out more broadly, partly because officials want to see if people can live on them. You can picture a man staring into a cup of thin brown liquid, wondering if this is progress or just a new flavor of misery. Once eating time ends, work begins. You are directed to one of the labor yards or workshops. The tasks range from mind-numbingly repetitive to physically exhausting. Classic prison jobs in this era include picking oak, which means sitting for hours teasing apart old tar, soaked rope into loose fibers. The tar clings to your fingers and gets under your nails. The smell is strong, a mix of pitch and seawater that seems to stick in your throat. After a while, your hands ache and your shoulders burn, but the pile of rope in front of you hardly seems to shrink. Other prisoners are set to break stones into smaller pieces, sometimes just for road-making, sometimes purely as punishment. The crash of hammer on rock echoes around the yard, a harsh percussion that keeps time with your heartbeat. Dust rises and gets into your nose and mouth. You start to understand why some people say the work is designed less to be useful and more to grind down pride. Historians still argue whether Victorian prison labor genuinely aims at rehabilitation through discipline or simply uses productivity as a thin excuse for suffering. Then there is the treadmill, one of the strangest and most notorious machines of the period. Imagine a huge wheel made of steps, like an endless rotating staircase. Prisoners stand side by side on its steps, gripping a bar for balance, and walk as the wheel turns under their feet. It can power a mill or simply move in circles for no real purpose. From your perspective, it feels endless. Your legs ache, your calves burn, sweat runs down your back, and all you have to look at is the wooden panel in front of your face. If you miss a step, you stumble into the person behind you, earning curses and possibly a shove. It is exercise without joy, motion without destination. Basically, the worst gym membership you never asked for. Inside workshops, the atmosphere is different, but not necessarily kinder. You might find yourself weaving mats, sewing rough clothing, or shaping metal fittings. The air smells of fibers, oil, and bodies. Tools clink and scrape. Supervising officers walk the rows, watching for laziness, talking, or any hint that someone might be turning a tool into a weapon. For some prisoners, learning a trade skill offers a sliver of hope. For others, it is another version of the same pattern. Do as you are told to a rhythm you did not choose. Under eyes that never quite relax. Between work sessions, there are periods that feel empty. You sit in your cell with nothing but your own thoughts, maybe a Bible or a moral tract if the chaplain has been active. Perhaps a slate and chalk if someone has decided you should learn to read. Time slows. You find yourself watching small things like how a shaft of light shifts along the wall, how dust motes twist in the air, how a crack in the stone looks slightly different as the day goes on. Boredom becomes its own punishment, stretching minutes into something wide and heavy. People cope in different ways. Some recite songs or poems silently to themselves. Others replay conversations from their old life, editing them to produce better comebacks they never got to use. A few carve tiny marks or symbols into wood or stone, little acts of resistance against being forgotten. There are stories of men counting bricks, beads of their rosary, anything, to give their mind a project. It sounds petty from the outside, but when days blur together, counting can feel like holding on to yourself. Not all of the day is controlled by rules, though it often feels that way. Small slippages occur. A warder might pause to share a quick human comment, almost a joke, before catching himself and straightening up. A scrap of extra bread might be passed along with a look that says, "Do not mention this." Sometimes a bird lands on the windowsill of a workshop, tilting its head as if confused by the sight of so many humans trapped inside. For a brief second, the movement of its wings draws every eye. That tiny flash of wildness feels sharper than any sermon. By evening, work has worn your muscles down, and food has only partly rebuilt them. You are not just tired in your body, you are tired in your thoughts. The day is a loop of controlled activity and forced stillness, meals that barely satisfy, tasks that exhaust without rewarding, moments of boredom that stretch so far they feel like they might swallow your sense of self. You can feel how this routine reshapes people, quietly filing away edges, teaching them to move when commanded and sit when told. What happens to someone who lives like this for months or years is not just a question of discipline, it is a question of who they become inside their own head. When the outside world has shrunk to food, work, and long, slow hours of nothing, you turn into another corridor and feel the atmosphere change even before you see who lives here. The sounds are different, higher voices, softer footsteps, and a strange mix of laughter and weeping drift toward you. A warder unlocks a gate, and you step into the part of Newgate reserved for those who do not fit the hard-edged image of the male criminal. Women, children, and people whose only crime is unpaid debt. The first thing you notice in the women's ward is the clutter. Even in strict conditions, women somehow manage to collect scraps of life. Shawls hang from pegs, bits of ribbon or lace, bright and dull clothing, and a few cells have tiny makeshift curtains rigged from old handkerchiefs. The air smells of soap, stale bodies, and a faint hint of something floral where someone has tucked dried lavender into a crack in the wall. One solid historical fact here is that Newgate maintains a separate women's side, supervised by female matrons as well as male officers. A small nod to propriety in a very unpret. You watch a matron stride past, keys at her waist, skirts swishing. Her eyes are sharp. She deals with everything from petty theft cases to women convicted of violent crime. Some are here because they stole food or fabric. Others are accused of killing an abusive husband or disposing of an unwanted newborn. You can feel how quickly Victorian society divides these women into categories in its imagination: fallen, dangerous, pitiable. Inside the walls, the labels blur. Everyone sleeps on hard beds, eats the same uninspiring food, and feels the same cold. A baby cries somewhere nearby. A thin wail that slices through, the murmur of voices. You turn your head and see a prisoner cradling a small bundle, rocking gently on a narrow bunk. Infants are sometimes allowed to stay with their mothers for the first months of life. The child has no idea that its first view of the world is a damp cell with barred windows. One quirky detail, repeated in later anecdotes, is that women occasionally stitch tiny secret messages into a baby's clothes before separation, hoping the child will one day find them. It is a sewing project with a very long emotional deadline. Children old enough to stand on their own are sometimes here not as visitors but as inmates. You see small faces peering out from doorways, eyes too big for thin cheeks. Some have snatched bread, picked pockets or broken windows. Others are simply swept up with their parents when a whole family falls into trouble. Ages can be brutally low. It is not unknown for a child of 10 or 11 to be tried in an adult court and sent here. You might see one boy trying to mimic the swagger of the older prisoners while another clings to the wall, shoulder pressed into the stone like it might open and let him out if he pushes hard enough. Teachers or chaplain occasionally visit these young inmates trying to bring a bit of education or religious instruction. You imagine a small class perched on benches, a slate on each lap, as an adult writes letters on a board and talks about obedience, industry, and faith. Historians still argue whether such efforts sincerely aim at giving children a second chance or mainly exist to make the authorities feel better about locking them up in the first place. You are led onward to another part of the prison where the mood is different again. This is where debtors stay, people who owe money rather than blood. Imprisonment for debt is a long-running feature of English law, though reforms gradually limit and reshape it through the 19th century. Here the crimes are mostly figures on paper, unpaid bills, failed businesses, and unlucky ventures. Yet the walls feel just as thick. Detours sometimes have slightly more freedom within their ward. You may see them moving about in groups, talking more openly, even receiving visitors with less formality than criminal prisoners. Money remains a constant theme. Those who still have a bit of cash can buy extra food, hire better bedding, or arrange small comforts. Those without must make do with whatever the prison issues. A man might have been respectable last month with a shop, a clerk, and a family. Now, he shares a cramped space with others who all fell on the wrong side of a ledger. One man leans against a wall, describing brought-in newspapers to a cluster of listeners. Another paces, muttering calculations, as if he can walk his way back into solvency. A third carefully folds and refolds a letter, from home until the creases form a worn pattern on the paper. You can sense how humiliation gnaws at them. For many, the shame of debt bites even deeper than confinement. Victorian culture prides itself on thrift and responsibility. To end up here feels like a public notice that you have failed on both counts. In a courtyard used by both women and debtors at different hours, you catch sight of something unexpected. A cat sits on a windowsill, neatly washing its paw, tail curled in easy comfort. It seems completely at home, ignoring rules, schedules, and human misery with perfect feline selfishness. Animals like this become semi-official mascots, fed scraps by prisoners and warders alike. Stories grow around them. One tale insists that a particular Newgate cat always left the condemned block the night before an execution, as if it could smell death coming. Whether or not that ever happened, people repeat it because it fits the mood. The children in this part of the prison watch everything. They track the warder's movements, the arrival of visitors, the pattern of keys changing hands. Some learned fast who can be charmed into small kindnesses. A shy smile here, a quick yes sir there may earn an extra crust of bread or a kind word. Others toughen their faces, deciding that showing softness is too risky. You see both strategies in the same corridor, small humans already experimenting with survival techniques adults barely understand in themselves. At certain times of day, the chapel receives its particular congregations from these wings. Women in shawls sit on one side, debtors in worn coats and frayed collars on the other. Children wedged between whoever will keep them roughly in line. Hymns sound thinner from throats that are tired or embarrassed. The chaplain talks about forgiveness, new beginnings, and the need to accept one's earthly trials. Some listen with shining eyes. Others stare at the floor, counting the boards. A few look straight at the windows where thin light filters through, thinking of streets, shops, and kitchens they cannot reach. You look around and realize this part of the prison holds a concentration of relationships. Mothers with babies, parents separated. From children, husbands and wives, parted by walls and visiting rules, families split by the line between debtor and criminal. It makes the place feel emotionally louder. Even when people are quiet, there are more tears, more sudden laughs, more whispered endearments, more fierce arguments over nothing. In between, a warder's voice cuts across the tension, reminding everyone that whatever dramas they live, the rules still hold. As you pass through the final gate of this section, the echo of those voices follows you. Women singing softly to restless infants, children asking questions no one wants to answer, debtors restlessly counting imaginary coins in their heads. This wing is not softer than the rest of the prison, only different punishment here is tangled up with poverty, gender expectations, and family ties. It is not just about locking bodies away. It is about trapping entire lives in small, cold rooms and hoping the order of stone and iron can control the chaos of human need. You follow the prison surgeon as he steps out of his small office, coat flapping slightly, medical bag in hand. He smells faintly of carbolic and tobacco, a combination that suggests both professional duty and the need to steady his nerves after long days in this place. His boots click along the stone as he starts his morning round, and you have the uneasy sense that whatever he is about to see, it is already worse than what you are expecting. The infirmary sits behind a heavy door marked off from the regular cell blocks. Inside, the light is a little better. The windows slightly larger, but the air still carries that familiar blend of damp sweat and something metallic underneath. Beds line the walls, narrow frames with thin mattresses where bodies lie in varying shades of exhaustion. Coughs punctuate. The silence, some sharp, some weak and ragged. The smell of illness hangs low, clinging to blankets and hair and skin. You watch as the surgeon pauses at the first bed. A man lies there with cheeks sunken and eyes too bright, chest rising and falling in little jerks. Each breath rattles. Consumption, what people now call tuberculosis, is a common visitor here. The prison has no special love for this disease, but its cramped rooms, poor ventilation, and underfed bodies make perfect hosts. One solid historical fact is that 19th century prisons frequently battle outbreaks of respiratory illnesses, and Newgate has its share. The surgeon presses a hand to the patient's chest, listens close, then straightens with a sigh. He makes a note in a small book, a neat line of ink that turns a human struggle into a record. A draft will be ordered, maybe a mixture of laudanum to ease the pain, and some tonic that promises more than it can deliver. Fresh air might help, but there is only so much of that to be had behind thick walls and small windows. At the next bed, a different kind of suffering waits. This man grips his stomach, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. His bucket tells its own ugly story. Diarrhea and dentry flourish wherever sanitation struggles, and the prison drains do not always keep up with the number of bodies using them. The surgeon asks a few brisk questions about pain and frequency, then prescribes rest, boiled water, perhaps a little chalk mixture for the bowels. It is more damage control than cure. You move along with him and watch as he checks hands, tongues, and eyes for signs of scurvy. The prison diet tries to meet official standards, but the lack of fresh fruit and vegetables takes its toll. Spongy gums, bruises that appear too easily, and aching joints hint at vitamin problems no one here can describe in modern terms. Instead, they call it dility, weakness, or just the result of a sinful life. Historians still argue whether prison medical reports understate the prevalence of such deficiencies to keep the system looking more humane than it really is. In a corner bed, a prisoner sits propped up, leg bandaged thickly. Half of his shin is swollen and angry red. He caught his skin on a piece of metal during labor and infection slid in fast. The surgeon unwraps the dressing, and the smell hits you sharp and unpleasant. He calls for carbolic solution, a relatively modern antiseptic, and begins to clean the wound. The patient hisses between his teeth but holds still. There is no promise that this will save the leg, but infection will certainly take it if nothing is done. Amputation lurks as a very real possibility in places like this. On a small side table you notice jars and bottles, laudanum, castor oil, peppermint water, tincture of opium, quinine and mysterious mixtures labeled with old-fashioned names. Leeches float sluggishly in a glass container, dark commas drifting in the murky water. That is your quirky detail for today. Even in Victorian prisons, these little bloodsuckers sometimes make an appearance, pressed in to serve ice as medical tools, rather than just an unpleasant surprise in a pond. The surgeon moves from bed to bed with a kind of weary efficiency. He is both gatekeeper and advocate. His reports can get a prisoner moved to lighter work, transferred to hospital, or kept in a cell despite complaints. Some inmates exaggerate illness, hoping for an easier day. Others hide symptoms, terrified that weakness will make them targets. Sorting truth from performance becomes part of his daily puzzle. Behind him walks an assistant or dresser carrying clean bandages and fetching water, eyes darting between patients and the clock. Not all suffering here is physical, and that becomes brutally obvious when he unlocks a particular side room. The air inside feels different, heavier in an invisible way. A man sits on the floor, knees drawn up, rocking slowly. His hair hangs lank over. His face and his lips move in a whisper only he hears. In another corner, someone mutters angrily at figures only they can see, hands twitching at invisible enemies. There are no specialized psychiatric wards in this building. Men who break under the pressure of confinement or who arrive already mentally ill are housed in small cells, often called refractory or observation rooms. Restraints hang on a peg, leather straps and canvas jackets designed to stop self-harm or violence toward others. The surgeon and chaplain argue from time to time about what to do with such people, and no one has a truly good answer. Historians still argue whether Victorian prisons cause more mental breakdowns than they record, or simply hide them behind words like obstinate, sullen, and uncontrollable. You watch as the surgeon crouches in front of one man and speaks quietly. He asks simple questions about name, place, and time. The answers come out jumbled, looping back on themselves. He makes another small note in his book, then orders tea. The prisoner be allowed more time outside the cell under watch in the hope that air and movement may steady his mind. There is talk sometimes of transferring particularly disturbed inmates to asylums, but space is limited and paperwork slow. Many stay where they are, trapped in a system built to punish, not to heal minds. In another wing, you visit a small room where women lie under thin blankets, their faces pale and drawn. Some have recently given birth in custody, bodies drained by labor and poor nutrition. Others suffer from chronic conditions that have been made worse by cold and stress. Chest, complaints, headaches, and persistent menstrual problems. The matron hovers nearby, half nurse, half disciplinarian. The surgeon shares a brief exchange with her about who is truly sick and who might be seeking a short break from work. Even here, suspicion and care are braided tightly together. Sometimes the surgeon finds himself caught between economy and compassion. Extra rations cost money. Medicines are not cheap. Prolonged stays in the infirmary strain. Limited space. Official visitors may tour these rooms, peering at patients and asking brisk questions about mortality rates. The numbers are written up in neat tables and sent to offices where the air smells less of sweat and more of paper. On those sheets, a life can become just one line in a column, marked discharged, transferred, or dead. As the round draws to a close, the surgeon returns to his office and drops his bag with a dull thud. He washes his hands in a bowl, the water clouding, quickly, then sits at his desk to complete his entries. Outside, someone coughs in the corridor. Somewhere else. A prisoner gasps as pain flares up, again. The gap between what medicine can do in this era and what is actually needed in a place like Newgate feels wide enough to swallow a person whole. You sit with that realization for a moment. Disease, malnutrition, and untreated mental strain are not side effects here. They are woven into the fabric of life behind these walls. The infirmary offers some relief. The surgeon applies what knowledge and tools he has, but the building itself keeps feeding fresh cases through its diet, its air, its rules, and its unrelenting pressure on the human mind. The beds fill as fast as they empty, and the rounds begin again, one frail body at a time. A bell rings, not harsh like the alarm that starts work, but steady and insistent. The sound travels along corridors and up stairways, collecting people as it goes. You are moved with a small group toward the chapel, feet scuffing stone, minds trying to decide whether this is a blessing, a break, or just another form of inspection. The air cools as you climb, and somewhere ahead you hear the faint rise and fall of voices already singing. The chapel door opens and you step into a room that feels oddly high compared with the cramped cells. Wooden pews line the floor, polished more by bodies and time than by wax. Light filters through tall windows, smudged by city smoke, but still generous compared to the slits in the cell blocks. At the far end, a pulpit rises, solid and elevated, a little wooden ship from which one man steers the moral direction of a very unwilling congregation. Prison regulations in the Victorian period make chapel attendance a regular, often compulsory part of life. Officially, this is where souls are guided, lessons are taught, and the power of Scripture is brought to bear on criminal hearts. You find your assigned place, usually separated by rank, gender, and status. Condemned prisoners might sit in a special gallery or enclosure, sometimes screened so that others cannot stare directly at them, yet everyone knows exactly where they are. That knowledge hangs in the air like another presence. The chaplain enters in his cassock and white collar, face set in a careful balance between sternness and compassion. He opens a large Bible, the pages edged with the fingerprints of many readings. His voice carries well in this space, trained by years of projecting to mixed crowds. He leads a hymn, and you hear the hesitant rise of voices around you. Some prisoners sing strongly, clutching at the melody as if it were a rope. Others mutter along, more interested in the chance to sit on a different sort of bench than in any promise of redemption. The hymn's words are all about mercy, cleansing, and new beginnings. It is hard not to notice the contrast between that language and the reality of shackles, locked doors, and fixed sentences. Historians still argue whether chapel in places like this genuinely softens hearts or mostly serves as a ritual that lets the authorities feel they have done their spiritual duty. From your seat it feels complicated. For some the words sink in, for others they bounce off stone and land nowhere. As the chaplain moves into his sermon, you listen to the rhythm more than the theology at first. He tells stories about wasted lives, sudden temptations, and the danger of small sins growing into large ones. Occasionally he slips in real examples, thinly disguised, of recent cases that everyone in the room recognizes. A thief becomes a nameless man in a parable. A poisoner appears as a warning figure. The message is clear. Crime leads to misery, repentance leads to peace, and the authorities are right in their justice. Sometimes it sounds like a faith lesson, sometimes like a public relations speech. Your eyes wander across the congregation. You see the tight jaw of a man determined not to be moved, the damp lashes of someone already on the brink of tears, the vacant stare of a prisoner whose mind is elsewhere. A few lips move in silent mockery, aping the chaplain's words into rude versions for private amusement. Humor survives in tiny, defiant forms. Somewhere near the back, a man actually nods off, his head jerking forward and then snapping up as a nearby warder taps the bench with a stick. Even salvation has attendants, requirements. The service ends with a prayer for the prisoners, the authorities, and the monarch, People rise and file out, but not everyone returns to regular labor. Some stay behind or are brought separately to smaller rooms where religion takes on a sharper edge. You are led along a passage toward the set of cells used for those awaiting execution. The floor feels different here, not because the stones have changed, but because the weight on them has. In one of these cells, a condemned prisoner sits on a stool, a Bible in his hands. The chaplain is already there, seated, opposite, speaking in a low, steady voice. On the small table between them lies a piece of paper, the written record of a death warrant. The prisoner's face shows that mixture of fear, disbelief, and exhaustion that words hardly capture. This is not a general talk about sin anymore. This is a countdown with scripture attached. Conversations in these rooms often become the raw material for what people outside call a good death. There is a strong Victorian idea that a proper final scene filled with confession, regret, and acceptance proves that justice and religion work together. The chaplain encourages the prisoner to acknowledge guilt, forgive enemies, and trust in divine mercy. Sometimes the condemned breaks down, sobbing and clinging to promises of heaven. Sometimes they insist on their innocence or admit only part of what they are accused of. Historians still argue whether published accounts of last confessions show real words or carefully edited performances designed to reassure the public. A quirky tradition grows up around such events. Printed broadsides, sold in crowds outside, claim to contain the prisoner's final speech, often with verses about the moral of the story. These sheets sometimes list how bravely or tearfully the condemned faced the end, almost like reviews of a stage performance. You can imagine the strange sensation of knowing that your final words might be turned into cheap souvenirs before the rope has even cooled. Inside the death cell, the performance is more private, but no less shaped by expectation. Warders, the chaplain, and occasionally officials watch the prisoner's behavior closely. Does he pray sincerely? In here, time shrinks to a narrow tunnel pointing toward the scaffold. Not all prisoners cooperate with the script. Some become sullen, refusing to speak beyond a few curt answers. Others swing between frantic pleading and bitter jokes. You can imagine a man cracking a grim comment about already having the worst possible appointment tomorrow, and the chaplain trying and failing to smile. The human mind reacts strangely when it knows the exact hour of its own end. There is no standard way to behave. Religion in this setting does several jobs at once. It comforts some, terrifies others, calms officials, impresses visitors, and gives the general public tidy narratives to hold onto inside the chapel and the death cells. You see how belief and power intertwine. Prayers are offered freely, but attendance is rarely optional. Confessions may come from genuine remorse or from a weary sense that everyone is waiting to hear certain words, and the easiest path is to speak them. When you step back out into the corridor, the sound of hymns seems to linger, mixed with the echo of boots and distant doors. The promise of salvation competes with the certainty of punishment. Every Bible, every whispered prayer, every carefully described final moment turns spiritual life into something watched, judged, and recorded. In a place built to control bodies, the chapel and the death cell are tools aimed at the invisible part of a person, shaping how they feel, think, and even die under the watchful eyes of church and state combined. You walk along a corridor where the air feels thicker, as if the stone is crowded with stories waiting for someone to listen. The water beside you taps a key against his ring, in a small, almost showy rhythm. It is not just a walk, it is a tour. He knows exactly which names make people's eyes widen, and he is quietly pleased to have them. He stops beside an ordinary-looking door. The wood is no grander than any other, the ironwork no shinier. Yet he tells you that many years ago one of the most talked-about forgers in England slept in that narrow space. Henry Fauntleroy, a banker who forged signatures and diverted huge sums of money, ended his days as a condemned man here before his execution in the early 19th century. His fall from respectability fascinated the public. They whispered about how a man trusted with fortunes could risk everything for more, and whether he deserved death for a crime of ink and paper. One solid historical fact is that forgery could be a capital offense, and Fontlai went to the gallows at Newgate for it. You imagine him lying on the hard bed, staring at the ceiling, fingers stained, with the ghost of signatures. Outside, crowds bought printed accounts of his trial, eager to follow every detail. Some readers worried that such tales might make financial crime look clever rather than wicked. Others just enjoyed the drama. The line between public education and guilty pleasure feels fuzzy from where you stand. Farther along, another cell carries a different set of echoes. Here, the legend of Jack Shepherd still clings to the walls, even though he belonged to an earlier age. He was a thief and escape artist, famous for breaking out of Newgate more than once before finally being hanged. By Victorian times, people tell his story like a dark fairy tale, full of daring, climbs, loosened irons, and nighttime roof scrambles. You can picture him, skinny and stubborn, testing every bar and brick for weakness. Historians still argue whether stories about figures like Shepherd encourage real criminals to imitate them, or simply give the poor a fantasy of beating a system stacked against them. The warder gestures toward the window at the end of the passage and mentions another immortal name, Michael Barrett, the Irish Fenian involved in the Clockenwell explosion. He was brought here for his role in a fatal attempt to free comrades from another prison. In 1868, he became the last person publicly hanged in England, outside these very walls. You taste the weight of that phrase, last public hanging. With him, an era of execution as street theater came to an end, though death by rope continued behind closed gates. Here and there you see chalked, initials on the stone half rubbed away. Some belong to people whose names never made the newspapers. Others might be the marks of men or women who briefly became famous enough to be gossiped about in drawing rooms. Notoriety in this place is a strange currency. It does not make the cell warmer or the food better, but it changes how people look at the building itself. You are led down a short flight of steps into a lower passage where the air feels heavier. In your mind you place Franz Müller here, the German Tor convicted of murdering Thomas Briggs on a railway carriage in 1864. That case terrified Victorians. It seemed to prove that even the new, impressive symbol of progress, the train, could become a site of sudden violence. Newspapers pounced on every detail, the hat, the watch, the blood in the compartment. Muller's journey. Why, from arrest to trial to Newgate, locked a whole country into a nervous fascination. You picture him alone in the dim light, the distant rumble of real trains outside never reaching these walls. His foreignness becomes part of the drama in the press. They argue about his guilt, his accent, even his expression on the scaffold. In an age obsessed with respectability and security, the idea of a quiet Tor turning killer on public transport seems almost designed to fuel nightmares. Some prisoners attract attention not for how they kill, but for how they behave once they are caught. You are shown a cell where a servant once waited for her fate after being convicted of murdering her employer. Her trial fueled endless chatter about the dangers hiding in servants' halls. Respectable families already distrust the idea of people who know their household secrets and have access to bedrooms, kitchens, and keys. A dramatic murder by a domestic servant feels like confirmation of every fearful whisper. There are reports that she maintained a stiff, almost theatrical composure, dressing carefully even on the morning of her execution. Whether that is entirely true or polished for effect, it fits the public appetite for striking final images. As you move on, the ward mentions how literary figures sometimes visit these corridors, escorted by officials. They are curious about criminal minds, interested in the atmosphere, eager for details to feed their fiction. Out in the wider world, certain novels are accused of glamorizing criminals and turning Newgate into a Gothic backdrop. Critics complain that readers care more about dashing rogues and tragic poisoners than about silent victims. Yet the books keep selling. People are drawn to the mix of danger and suffering, even when they insist they only want moral improvement. In a small high room, phrenologists once stood with plaster and me, assuring tape, ready to cast the heads of executed criminals after death. That is your quirky detail here. They believed skull shapes revealed character, so they made busts of notorious figures to display in lecture halls and private collections. You can imagine a row of pale plaster heads, each labeled with a name, a crime, and a moral lesson, all taken from bodies that swung outside these walls. It is a chilling display, half science, half sideshow. Not every notorious inmate is a killer or forger. Political prisoners pass through too, especially in times of agitation. Chartists, Fenians, radical, pamphleteers, people who challenge the social order with ideas rather than blades, occasionally find themselves under Newgate's roof. Some treat their confinement as a badge of honor, writing letters and memoirs that paint them as martyrs of conscience. To sympathetic readers, these men are heroes. To the state, they are troublemakers who need a hard reminder of limits. Historians still argue whether such imprisonments ultimately strengthen political movements by giving them martyrs or weaken them by scaring off potential followers. As you stand in one of the corridors, you can almost feel the crowd of invisible figures pressing in around you. A banker who signed false names, a thief who wriggled through impossible gaps, a bomber who shook a city, a quiet tour turned railway nightmare. Servants, radicals, desperate, lovers with poison bottles and cold-deed planners of brutal crimes. Their real bodies are long gone, but their stories sink into the stone. Outside, these stories become currency. Broadside sellers shout their names on execution days. Illustrators sketch their faces from the dock. Ballads circulate that exaggerate their words and deeds. People recite these tales at firesides, adding a little extra drama each time. Newgate turns human catastrophe into a kind of narrative factory. For every anonymous prisoner who dies with barely a line of print, there is another whose name becomes a shorthand for some fear, temptation, or warning. You take a slow breath and consider what it would feel like to be one of the ordinary inmates listening to all this, sharing a hallway with a famous killer or a notorious forger. Might bring a strange mix of dread and curiosity. Some might boast of it later, if they ever get out. Others might secretly resent how much attention one person draws while hundreds of quieter miseries go unnoticed. Fame down, here does not change the iron of the bars. It only changes how stories are told once the cell is empty and the door stands ajar. You notice that the prison never feels completely still. Even when the official routines quiet down, there is a different kind of movement under the surface, like currents in a river that looks calm from above. Keys jingle, boots pass, doors shut. Yet behind all that, whispers slide along stone, hands trade things they are not supposed to have, and silence suddenly looks a lot like a disguise. You stand in a dim side corridor near a gate where two warders are talking just a little too casually. One holds a ledger, the other leans against the wall, thumbs hooked in his belt. A visitor has just come through, coat a bit too fine for this place, hat pulled low. On paper, he is here to see a relative, perhaps to discuss a solicitor or bring news from home. In reality, he leaves behind more than words. You watch as the warder pats him down at the entrance, but the patting feels more like a performance than a serious search. Later, when the visitor has gone and the gate is locked again, something small passes from warder to prisoner with almost invisible ease. A folded scrap of paper, a twist of cloth, a packet no bigger than a thumb. The prisoner disappears down a corridor already pla. Then how to divide the treasure, money, tobacco, a knife blade, or perhaps a little bottle of gin in a cleverly disguised container. Smuggling survives on imagination and fear. 2. Much of the second feeds demand for the first. In older times, before Victorian, reforms tried to impose cleaner rules. Prisons like this were notorious for open bribery. Governors and turnkeys often charged fees for everything from food to irons being removed. One solid historical fact is that early 19th century investigations into London prisons uncovered regular payments for better rooms and lighter treatment, a practice that official regulations later tried to crush. Yet even with tighter oversight, the habit of slipping coins for favors does not vanish overnight. It simply goes quieter. You see how small advantages multiply. A prisoner with money from family or hidden away before arrest can buy extra food, tobacco, perhaps a blanket in winter. That blanket might be rented, technically, but the line between renting and bribing blurs when there is no receipt. Those without resources watch unequal comforts appear in nearby cells and feel a fresh layer of resentment settle over the existing misery. Rules say everyone is treated the same. Reality raises one eyebrow at that and carries on. A quirky little trick that makes its way into whispered stories involves hollowed-out loaves of bread. The idea is simple. Someone outside carefully slices open a loaf, scoops out part of the soft inner crumb, slips in a wrapped parcel, and then presses the crust back in place before sending it in as part of a food delivery. From the outside, it looks innocent. From the inside, it becomes a portable treasure chest. You can picture the look on a prisoner's face when a knife cuts into the loaf and hits something that clinks instead of crumbles. In a workshop, you watch as two men work side by side on apparently innocent tasks, maybe sewing or rope picking. Their hands move steadily, but their eyes flick up whenever a ward's boots approach. Between them, a tiny roll of paper passes from palm to palm, cupped and hidden by the rhythm of their labor. It might be a message to another part of the prison, a shorthand list of debts, or news from outside that needs to circulate. Information here is almost as valuable as food. Knowing who is being transferred, who is sick, who has money, who is angry, all shapes the small strategies that keep people safe. A warder steps in and the atmosphere shifts. He walks slowly along the benches, glancing at hands, tools, and faces. He has seen almost every trick. People have tried to pull coins sewn into waistbands, letters hidden between layers of fabric, bottles disguised as medicine. The difference between a helpful officer and a harsh one can decide whether such tricks succeed or lead to punishment. Historians still argue whether most officers quietly tolerate low-level smuggling to keep a kind of balance, or whether corruption is driven more by greed than by any rough sense of management. You find yourself in a laundry area where water sloshes in big tubs and steam clouds the air. Clothes hang from lines heavy and dripping. This is another place where secrets travel. A scrap of cloth with words stitched in a hidden corner, a note slipped into a folded shirt, even ink marks that look like random blotches to a casual eye, but form letters to someone who knows the code. It is the prison version of a secret messaging app, just with worse graphics and more soap. Out in one of the yards, a small group of prisoners walks in slow circles, guarded but not chained. Among them moves a man with a careful gait, coat buttoned up tighter than necessary. His pockets hang slightly heavier on one side. He might be a go-between, someone who trades goods and news across different parts of the prison. People like this often start with one small favor. They pass a note or carry a verbal message. Once it works, others see an opportunity. Before long, the go-between controls a little network, taking payment in whatever currency is available. Food, protection, information. Corruption is not only about smuggling in luxuries. Sometimes it is about avoiding pain. An officer who looks the other way when a prisoner skips a workload. A doctor who writes a slightly softer report. A clerk who misplaces a particularly harsh paper. Each act has its price, whether in cash, favors, or quiet loyalty. These choices can mean the difference between a week in the punishment cell and a stern lecture. From the outside, it might look simple to condemn all this as rotten. From inside, it feels closer to the way humans always bend systems to make them survivable. You hear stories of warders who build discreet alliances with certain prisoners, especially those who are educated, literate, or simply good at reading people. A man who can write letters for others becomes valuable. So does someone who can keep the peace in a noisy cell block, calming tempers before they boil over. In exchange, those prisoners might get a little more leeway, fewer inspections, or an extra minute at the door when visitors come. The result is a complicated web where rules, fear, and favors are knotted together. Now and then the web snaps. A search turns up, contraband, and an example must be made. You watch as a cell is turned inside. Out, straw tossed into the corridor, mattress slit open, blankets shaken, and clothing ripped from hooks. An officer holds up a small bottle or a hidden blade with a look of righteous disgust that might be entirely real or partly performed. Punishments follow. Lost, privileges, solitary confinement, maybe hard labor on the treadmill. Official rapport. TS record these incidents with stiff language about discipline. They rarely include the full chain of people who help the contraband arrive. Rumors say that even executions sometimes attract hidden commerce. A better seat in a window nearby, a chance to sell food to the crowd, an advanced copy of a last confession. Human beings will find a way to turn any event into a transaction. You can imagine someone laughing bitterly at the idea of people paying for a closer look at a scaffold while others risk punishment to sip smuggled gin in the cell blocks below. You step back and look at the whole picture in your mind. On the surface, Newgate runs on rules, times, and official hierarchies. Underneath it also runs on quiet trades, small bribes, whispered favors, and the constant negotiation between what the law demands and what people can bear. Secrets seep through cracks in the stone, carried in pockets, loaf crusts, washing baskets, and whispered deals in shadowed corners. In a place built to control everything, that covert flow of goods and information becomes its own kind of heartbeat, stubbornly human in a world of stone and iron. Night settles slowly as if it is reluctant to enter this place, but eventually even thick walls cannot hold back the dark. Lamps are lit in the corridor outside, turning the stone a dull yellow. In the condemned cell, the light is smaller, a single flame that throws shadows across rough walls and makes every movement look exaggerated. You sit on the narrow bed, feeling the boards beneath the thin mattress, and realize that this is not just another night. It is the last one. The sound of the city reaches you in scraps, a distant carriage wheel on cobbles, the faint murmur of voices somewhere beyond the prison yard, a dog barking once and then again. These little noises feel sharper than usual, like points pressing into your awareness. Every one of them reminds you that life is carrying on outside, indifferent to what will happen at dawn. Inside, time has a different texture. It feels thicker, like honey that will not quite pour. The clock in the corridor strikes the hour, each clang heavy and deliberate. The water at the door shifts. His weight, he has been assigned to stay close, never quite out of sight, never quite relaxed. His presence is meant to prevent self-harm or last-minute chaos. He carries keys and authority, but tonight he also carries an uncomfortable awareness that he will walk beside you in the morning to a place no one truly wants to go. He checks the lock again, not because he doubts it, but because habit is a way to keep his mind from drifting toward what is coming. On the small table, a Bible lies open where the chaplain left it. You can still hear the echo of his voice from earlier, reading passages about forgiveness and rest for the weary. His visits today have been more frequent, the questions more direct. Are you at peace? Have you prayed? Is there anyone you need to forgive? You answered as best you could, or you deflected, or you sat in heavy silence while he filled the air with words. For him this night is a test of his work. For you it is a tightrope between fear and numbness. Historians still argue whether such intense attention from clergy in final hours truly comforts the condemned, or mainly serves to reassure those who watch from the safety of records and pews. Somewhere behind the walls, preparations are underway. The scaffold must be checked, ropes tested, the drop measured. A carpenter runs calloused fingers along wood to feel for splinters. The official hangman, often a figure both feared and morbidly famous, goes through his own ritual. One solid historical fact is that the English executioner of this era calculates the length of the drop according to weight and BU. Ild, trying to ensure a rapid neck break instead of slow strangulation. The Science of it does not make the outcome any more pleasant to contemplate. You hear footsteps approach and stop outside the door. The key turns and the chaplain steps in again, followed by another official, perhaps the governor or a magistrate. They ask if there is anything you wish to say, any letter you want written, any final request within the narrow bounds allowed. Some condemned ask for a specific meal, a last taste of something from ordinary life. Others want to see a family member. One more time. A few shake their heads, too tired to shape more words. If a family visit is permitted, it happens under watch. You see the face of someone you love appear in the doorway, eyes red-rimmed, hand pressed to their mouth for a heartbeat before they steady themselves. The water stands just close enough to hear every word, trying not to intrude and yet required to listen. You speak in hurried overlapping sentences, trying to cram memories, apologies, instructions, and love into a small pocket of time. Jokes appear unexpectedly, thin and crooked, but real, as if your minds instinctively reach for something lighter to keep from breaking. When they leave, the empty space where they stood feels huge. The corridor swallows their footsteps, and the door closes with a sound that stings. No matter what you said or did not say, it is over. The chaplain offers another prayer, softer this time, as if even he has run low on words. The governor says a formal farewell and steps back into the world of procedures and signatures. You are left with the ward, the Bible, the ticking of time, and the taste of goodbye still clinging to your throat. Strange thoughts creep in during the long hours. You remember small trivial things, the pattern on a kitchen plate, a particular creak in the floorboard of your room, the smell of rain on dust in some long-forgotten summer. Your mind loops through details that have nothing to do with charges, trials, or gallows. It is as if your memory is trying to anchor you somewhere else, even as your body remains on this hard bed in this cold cell. The warder, trying to stay awake, occasionally offers a few human words. He may mutter that you should try to sleep, although he knows that is unlikely. He might mention that the night will pass faster if you lie down and close your eyes, even if sleep does not come. You sense his discomfort. He is part of the machinery that will move you toward the scaffold. But tonight he also shares the same stale air, the same ticking clock. In a place where roles are rigid, this small shared night feels oddly intimate. A quirky tradition flits across your mind, something you once heard in a crowded room. There were people who believed that a touch from the hand of a freshly hanged man could cure certain ailments like scrofula or skin complaints. On execution days, some even tried to press close enough to the scaffold to stretch out a hand to the body. It is a superstition that mixes medical desperation with grim opportunism. Thinking of it now on this side of midnight is like staring at a distorted mirror of your own situation. The hours drag. You eat a little of the food that has been brought, more from habit than hunger. You sip water that tastes of tin and stone. Now and then you stand and pace the small rectangle, a floor counting steps. 1, 2, 3, turn, 1, 2, 3, turn. The walls do not move, but something in your chest shifts each time. You reach the same corner. You sit again because there is nowhere else to go. Sleep comes in short, jagged pieces, if at all, each dose ending with a jerk as if your body refuses to be taken by surprise. Outside, the prison gradually quiets. Workshops fall silent. The last clatter of dishes aids. Distant. Conversations thin out. The building settles into heavy stillness, broken only by the occasional cough or muffled cry from other cells. In that loosened hush, every sound from the corridor feels magnified. A key placed on a hook, a quiet word between waters, the creak of leather as someone shifts their belt. These noises tell you that the world of duty and order is still moving around you even as your personal horizon shrinks to the next few hours. Toward the small hours, the chaplain returns once more. His voice is quieter, his posture less formal. He may read another passage or simply sit and let silence stretch between you. If you choose to speak now, the words are often simpler. There is less need to impress, argue, or defend. You might confess, or you might not. You might talk about childhood, regrets, or nothing at all. The warder listens with one ear, gaze fixed on the floor, giving you as much privacy as the setting allows. When the clock finally moves toward dawn, the darkness in the cell feels thin, ready to tear. The lamp burns low, its flame shivering slightly. Your body is stiff from half-sleep and cold air. Your eyes, gritty, your thoughts stretched tight. You know, in a way that touches bone, that when the next full light fills this room, you will not see it from here. The long night has done its slow work, stripping away distractions, leaving you face to face with the simple, difficult fact of what comes next. You stand pressed in among thousands of bodies on a cold London morning, the kind of chill that slips right through your coat and settles behind your ribs. The sky is a pale, washed-out grey, and the stone front of Newgate looms above you, its windows blank and uninterested. Out here, though, there is nothing blank about the scene. The street in front of the prison has become a rough, noisy theatre. Every window and rooftop that looks the scaffold is packed with people who got up very early or paid good money to be there. You shift your feet on the uneven cobbles. You've been here long enough that your toes feel numb, but the crowd keeps you stuck in place, wedged between a man who smells of beer and onions and a woman with a shawl pulled tight around her face. Around you, voices rise and fall in bursts. People talk about the case, argue over the condemned person's guilt, complain about the cold, and tell jokes that are just a shade too loud for the circumstances. Your modern brain might quietly whisper that this feels less like moral reflection and more like a very grim street festival. Vendors weave in and out of the masses as far as they can push. One shouts about hot pies, steam leaking from a dented tin container. Another carries a tray of gingerbread, each piece stamped with little figures that look suspiciously like tiny dangling bodies. That is your quirky detail here. There are stories of bakers selling hanging-themed snacks on execution days, as if the event needed branding. People buy anyway because even when you are watching a life end, your stomach still insists on being part of the conversation. Near you, a boy with a tray slung around his neck cries out the latest printed broadsides. The sheets flap in the wind, covered in dense text and crude woodcut illustrations. Titles proclaim the name of the condemned in bold, promise a full account of the crime, the trial, and the sorrowful last speech. Some even include verses in sing-song rhyme, easy to memorize, so people can take the story home and recite it by the fire. One solid historical fact is that such broadsides were a staple of public executions in London, sold by the thousands to eager crowds. You watch as people hand over coins and start reading aloud to those around them. One man stumbles over a line and laughs, then clears his throat and tries again in a more solemn tone. Listeners nod, gasp, or scoff at different points depending on whether they believe the printed version or think it leaves out something important. Historians still argue whether these sheets mainly spread fear of crime or whether they turned criminals into twisted folk heroes in the public imagination. The street grows more crowded as the hour nears. Windows facing the front of the prison are crammed with faces. Some belong to families who live there and have simply leaned out for a free view. Others belong to people who paid the residents for space at a window or on a balcony, treating it like a private box in a theater. Up on one roof you can just make out the outline of chairs set out along the parapet, their occupants wrapped in blankets and cloaks, watching with the clinical curiosity of people who will be back to porridge and tea soon after the drop. The scaffold itself rises in front of the prison wall, a wooden platform with a trap in the center and a stout beam above. The rope hangs from that beam, its loop resting against the wood like a sleeping snake. A black curtain or awning may be fixed behind, part backdrop, part way to hide, part of the final details from those too squeamish for close inspection. Around the scaffold, troops or police stand, ready, forming a barrier between the structure and the heaving crowd. You hear jokes whispered in the crush. Someone wonders aloud if the condemned will need a handkerchief. Another speculates about whether the hangman will botch the job. Gallows humor thrives here, which is darkly appropriate. Occasionally a voice speaks out in a different tone, quieter but sharper, saying that this is no place for children. The children, of course, are already here, perched on shoulders, clinging to railings, eyes wide. Parents claim that seeing such a sight will scare them straight, as if terror can be bottled and used as a kind of moral medicine. Farther back in the crowd, pockets and purses are not safe. Public executions are famous for attracting pickpockets and other opportunists. You can feel how the pushing and shoving create a perfect cover for a quick hand. One person might leave this event with fewer coins than they arrived with, and not notice until they are halfway home. The irony of being robbed while watching a punishment for crime is not lost on anyone who hears about it. It is practically a standing joke in the city. The mood shifts abruptly when a murmur rolls through the people at the front. Heads turn toward the prison door that opens onto the scaffold. Guards step out first, stiff and official, then watched. By what feels like the whole world squeezed into a single street, the condemned appears. You see a figure in prison dress, perhaps with a white cap already loosened and hanging back, perhaps with arms bound lightly. The crowd goes silent for a moment, as if someone has pressed a giant mute button. You can hear your own breath, the creak of wood as feet step onto the platform. The chaplain stands close, book in hand, lips moving in a last prayer. His voice may be partly drowned by the murmur that rises again, but the gestures are clear. He offers words about mercy and hope, about forgiveness and eternal rest. The condemned person might repeat a few phrases or stare straight ahead with fixed eyes. Now and then somebody speaks, a final sentence aloud, sometimes insisting on their innocence, sometimes warning others not to follow their example, sometimes muttering something that the crowd will argue over for weeks. The hangman works quickly, adjusting the rope, placing the knot, perhaps securing the prisoner's legs. This is his craft, ugly but practiced. People squint to see whether the rope looks right, whether the condemned is trembling or standing firm. Some in the back stand on tiptoe. Others jump a little to see over hats. You hear a woman near you whisper that she cannot look, then immediately crane her neck to look. Anyway, there is a pause long enough for every heartbeat in the street to go out of sync. Officials check the time. A hand signal passes. The lever is pulled for a moment that will be retold many ways. The body drops, the rope snaps taut, and a collective gasp rushes out of thousands of lungs at once. Some people scream, others cross themselves or bow their heads. A few disturbingly cheer as if they have just seen the end of a play instead of a life. You feel your own stomach twist. The actual moment is quicker than all the waiting that built up to it, but heavier in your senses. The body hangs there, still or twitching. The rope sways slightly. The chaplain continues to pray in a steady voice. Officers watch the face of the condemned, counting the seconds, making sure the law has done its work. It is methodical, almost clinical, yet the emotional charge in the air crackles like static. After a time, the tension begins to leak away. People start talking again, louder now. Some argue about whether the person died bravely or cowardly, which is a strange argument to have from a cobbled street. Others begin to move off, eager to be first back to shops and homes with fresh gossip. Vendors shout one last time, offering more broadsides, this time with added lines about how the criminal met their end. The crowd becomes a river again, flowing away from the gallows, leaving behind a few stragglers and the practical business of removing the body. As you are swept along by the movement, you feel how the spectacle has worked on every person present in a slightly different way. For some, it satisfies a hunger for justice. For others, it is a shudder-inducing entertainment they will secretly replay in their heads. For children, it is a terrible, vivid picture that might haunt their dreams or shape their ideas of punishment forever. The state intends this scene to be a visible warning, a public lesson in consequences. Whether it truly scares people away from crime or simply feeds a morbid curiosity is a question that no neat printed broadside can honestly settle. Morning comes again, but this time the street outside does not fill with thousands of people. There is no scaffold bolted to the prison wall, no vendors with steaming pies, no children perched on shoulders for a better view. The law has changed. Executions are no longer outdoor theater. They are sealed inside the prison, away from public eyes. The city wakes up, goes to work, buys bread, and many people do not even know that inside these walls someone is about to die. You find yourself in a small inner yard, hemmed in by high stone. The sky, a narrow rectangle, above. The scaffold stands here now, plain and functional, its beams dark against the light. No banners, no wide open space, no jostling crowd. The wood cacks softly when a ward walks across it to check the trap, then cacks again as he steps off. It looks more like a piece of machinery than a stage. That is the point. The change from public to private executions in the late 1.86 seconds is a clear historical fact. The Capital Punishment Amendment Act in 1868 requires death sentences to be carried out within prison walls, not in the open street. Politicians and reformers insist that hanging should be solemn, orderly, and free of the rowdy circus that used to gather outside. Supporters call it a victory for decency. Critics mutter that the state prefers to hide its own violence once it starts to look embarrassing. You stand among a select group far smaller than the old crowds. There are officials from the prison, a sheriff or magistrate, the chaplain, the surgeon, a few carefully chosen witnesses, and sometimes a reporter or two. Each has a defined role. The sheriff confirms that the law must take its course. The chaplain offers the final prayers. The surgeon will later certify death. The reporter holds a notebook, watching everything with sharp, hungry eyes. It feels like a meeting rather than a spectacle, except that everyone knows what waits at the center of the agenda. Inside the adjoining building, the condemned prisoner spends the last hours in a special cell close to the yard. The chaplain visits frequently, voice low and urgent. The appointed hangman arrives quietly rather than being greeted by gossiping crowds. One solid historical fact is that figures like William Calraftoft or later William Marwood become minor public names, but their work here happens behind stone and iron instead of under the open sky. The hangman checks his rope and gear in a small side room, movements practiced and brisk. When the time comes, a procession forms, but it is short and controlled. You watch as the cell door opens. The prisoner steps out, flanked by warders. The chaplain walks in front, reading from his Bible. There is no roar from a crowd, only the echo of boots on stone, and the low murmur of prayer. You can hear the prisoner breathing, hear your own breathing, hear the slight metallic jingle of keys. That closeness makes it feel more intimate and strangely more intense. The small group enters the yard. Cold air meets warm breath. The scaffold waits. The hangman steps forward, face set in professional concentration. The chaplain continues his reading, voice rising slightly as if it can hold the space together. The prisoner climbs the steps, maybe with support, maybe steady, maybe faltering. In this confined setting, every detail is sharper. The tremor of a hand, the tightening of a jaw, the tiny hitch in a sentence. There is nowhere for your attention to drift. New rituals grow around this privacy. A black flag may be hoisted above the prison at the moment of execution, a visual signal to the city that the sentence has been carried out. Inside, witnesses watch closely, then sign their names in official documents confirming that everything was done according to regulation. A quirky detail from these years is how some reporters compete over who can describe the inner scene most precisely, noting the color of the prisoner's hair, the way the rope sat on the neck, even how long the body hung before being cut down. Very little of this new privacy is truly silent. You stand just far enough back to see the whole structure, yet near enough to feel the vibration when the trap falls. The drop is calculated now, at least in theory, to break the neck quickly. The executioner measures the rope based on weight and build. Watching here, you know that the science still sometimes fails. Now and then the drop is too short and strangulation follows. Now and then it is too long with its own gruesome consequences. Historians still argue whether moving executions inside encouraged more professional care or simply reduced outside scrutiny of failures. The chaplain's voice continues a moment after the body drops, then fades into silence. The surgeon steps up, fingers checking for pulse and breath. He listens, waits, then nods. That nod is the quiet hinge between life and death, between trial and finality. The officials record the time. The witnesses, including any journalists, take in the scene, some with pale faces, others with the practiced detachment of people who have done this more than once. You can tell, even here, that some will sleep poorly tonight. Afterward, the body is taken down and prepared for burial. No public display, no extended, hanging above a jeering crowd. In many cases, the remains are buried within the precincts of the prison in unmarked graves. The ground gradually becomes a hidden map of final sentences, names, and crimes lost beneath grass or paving. On the surface, the building looks unchanged. Underneath, the earth holds a quiet record very few ever see. The phrase, buried in unconsecrated ground, gains a particular chill when you picture this yard. Outside the prison, people read about what happened instead of watching it. Newspapers print detailed accounts of the crime, the trial, and the execution. Sometimes in columns so vivid, you can practically smell the damp stone through the ink. Pamphlets and broadsides do not vanish. They simply shift focus, turning the invisible final scene into a literary one. You might joke very softly that execution has become a print-only performance, exclusive access for those who buy the right edition. The absence of a public crowd changes the city's rhythm on hanging days. Shops no longer close because everyone has walked to Newgate. Street hawkers lose one of their busiest mornings. Children hear fewer first-hand stories from parents who went to see the lesson themselves. Instead, people debate in parlor and taverns about whether this new privacy is progress. Some say it removes the brutal carnival that once stained London's reputation. Others argue that hiding the rope behind LS makes it easier to ignore or even abuse. The conversation shifts from spectacle to principle. From your vantage point inside the yard, you feel the difference in your bones. The noise is smaller, the movement's more contained, yet the emotional pressure is no lighter. In some ways it is heavier because there is no crowd noise to dilute it, no jostling to distract you, just the scaffold, the rope, the officials, and the quiet acceptance that this is how the law chooses to end a life. As you step back from the scene, you realize that the prison has changed from a place that stages punishments for thousands to watch into a place where the most extreme punishment happens almost entirely out of public sight, recorded on paper, echoed in print, and carried forward as a story rather than a spectacle. A carriage pulls up outside the prison gate, shinier than most that pass this way. You see a gloved hand draw back the curtain and a face peer out, curious and just a little wary. This is not a relative visiting a prisoner or a lawyer with a bundle of papers. This is someone with influence, a reformer, a reporter, or a government inspector. And today the prison is on display. You can almost feel the walls straighten their shoulders. Inside boots move faster than usual. Floors are swept again. Straw is kicked into neater piles and warders make sure their jackets are buttoned high. The governor stands ready in his office. Papers stacked tidily on the desk. On those sheets are numbers that sum up the human contents of this building. How many prisoners? How many sick? How many on hard labor? How many punished? One solid historical fact is that 19th century authorities love statistics. Blue-covered reports and committee papers will later quote these figures as proof that things are improving or that they urgently need to. You walk behind the visiting party as the main door opens. The governor explains the route in a smooth, practiced voice. The inspector, perhaps an MP or a senior official, nods and makes notes in a little book. A journalist might be present too, notebook in hand, eyes flicking from cell doors to faces. storing details that will later turn into columns for readers who will never come within 50 yards of this place. Everyone understands that today the prison is both a working institution and a piece of evidence. The tour stops at a cell block. The visitors peer in through open doors. They see narrow beds, tin, dishes, buckets, and whitewashed walls. A prisoner stands, cap in hand, while the governor explains his diet, his work, and his sentence. The inspector asks about ventilation and discipline, perhaps quoting regulations as if the written rules were reality. The governor replies politely, stressing the orderliness of the place. Historians still argue whether such official visits ever capture the true daily conditions, or simply record the best-dressed version of them. Next, the party moves to a workshop. Here, men bend over oakum, stone or cloth, hands busy, eyes flicking up to register the unusual presence. The inspector asks about the value of prison labor, whether it pays for itself, whether it undercuts honest workers outside. The governor talks about discipline, the reforming influence of steady work, and the importance of keeping idle hands busy. The journalist, meanwhile, notices a bandaged hand, a hacking cough, or the way one man's shoulders slump with unhidden exhaustion. Those are the details that make good copy later. You can almost hear the headline forming somewhere behind those focused eyes. Sometimes a well-known social critic steps through these spaces. A writer like Charles Dickens or Henry Mayhew has walked similar corridors in other institutions, listening and observing. Such visitors might later describe the smell, the sounds, and the expressions they saw, weaving them into a narrative that reaches far more people than any official report. They can be fiercely critical, pointing out hypocrisy in a system that claims to reform while clearly grinding people down. At the same time, their accounts sometimes carry their own biases. Historians still argue whether such writers present prisons exactly as they find them or heighten certain horrors for dramatic and moral effect. The tour enters a special room where visitors are allowed to speak with selected prisoners under watch. A man in chains answers questions in a low voice, explaining his crime, his background, his treatment. Sometimes you can tell he plays to the audience a little, emphasizing suffering or repentance depending on who is listening. If he thinks a sympathetic description might earn him some public support, he will lean into it. If he is bitter, he might use the moment to complain about unfairness. The reporter scribbles furiously, delighted because this is what editors love, direct voices from the inside. A quirky detail appears, in the form of a sketchbook. One of the visitors, perhaps an artist working for an illustrated paper, quietly draws quick lines while the governor talks. Later, those lines will turn into a wood engraving for publication. A gloomy interior, bars emphasized, a figure hunched on a bunk, two officials, in stiff posture. The caption will speak of Newgate in bold letters. People miles away will stare at that picture over their breakfast, feeling as if they, too, have stepped briefly inside. It is a Victorian version of prison photography and documentary footage, just with more ink and less reliable perspective. From time to time, official inquiries dig much deeper than a single tour. Parliamentary committees summon witnesses to answer questions under oath. Governors, chaplain, surgeons, and ex-prisoners may all find themselves giving evidence about diet, flogging, solitary confinement, and the effects of the separate and silent systems. Some speak cautiously, afraid to offend powerful superiors. Others, especially retired officials or reformers with nothing to lose, describe harsh punishments and grim neglect in painful detail. Thick reports emerge packed with testimony and recommendations. Whether anyone actually reads all of them is another question. You listen as one reformer talks earnestly about classification and rehabilitation. He wants first offenders separated from hardened criminals, children kept far from adult influence, and education made central to prison life. Punishment, he insists, should correct, not merely hurt. His opponents respond that too. Much comfort will only encourage crime. That fear of places like Newgate is a necessary deterrent. Somewhere in this debate, the actual voices of prisoners often get lost, drowned by well-meaning theories and hardline speeches. Journalists play their own balancing act. A strongly worded article exposing filthy cells or cruel treatment can push readers to demand change. At the same time, newspapers rely on sensational stories to sell. That creates a temptation to linger on the most lurid details, turning misery into entertainment. One moment, the paper calls for reform. The next, it publishes an exaggerated tale of some villain in chains, complete with dramatic illustration. You could say the Victorian press wants to have its moral outrage and eat it too, preferably with a catchy headline. Official inquiries occasionally produce real changes. Rules are tightened, certain punishments reduced, sanitation improved. New buildings elsewhere are designed with more light and air, claiming lessons learned from dark places. Some people hail this as progress, proof that society is becoming more humane. Others note how slowly such improvements arrive, and how often they seem to depend on scandal rather than simple compassion. It is easier, after all, to fix a problem once it has embarrassed those in charge. You drift a little to one side and watch the visitors themselves as they leave the cell blocks. Their faces carry mixed expressions: pity, disgust, determination, curiosity, and occasionally an uncomfortable hint of fascination. A few look genuinely shaken, blinking more than usual as they step back into the daylight of the outer yard. Others speak briskly of times, costs, and regulations, as if they are stepping out of a meeting room rather than a place filled with bruised lives. As they climb back into their carriage, their impressions travel with them toward offices, drawing rooms, newspaper desks, and parliamentary benches. Out there, words about this place will be spoken, printed, argued over. Inside, routines continue with only slight adjustments. A new rule here, a fresh coat of whitewash there, a punishment recorded a little more carefully. The gap between the drama of reform talk and the stubborn daily reality of prison life remains wide. You are left with the sense that this building lives under layered gazes. Officials look at it as a machine that must run efficiently. Reformers see it as a problem to be solved or softened. Reporters treat it as a source of stories that sell and shock. Everyone claims to speak for justice, safety, or mercy. In the end, though, it is the people sleeping on the hard bunks and walking the worn floors who feel the real weight of every decision made in distant rooms lined with polished wood and tidy green bays. You walk toward the prison front on a different kind of day, the air full of grit instead of fog. Hammers ring, chisels bite stone, and the familiar bulk of Newgate looks strangely wounded. Parts of the outer wall are already gone, revealing jagged edges where solid blocks used to meet. Scaffolding hugs the remaining structure, wooden poles tied together in a rough skeleton around a dying giant. The building that once swallowed people is now being taken apart, one clattering piece at a time. You step closer and see workers in flat caps and rolled-up sleeves guiding heavy stones down on ropes. Dust drifts like pale smoke whenever a chunk of masonry hits the ground. The sound is nothing like a crowd roaring at an execution. It is more like a constant crunch, as if the city has decided to chew this place, slowly. In the early years of the 20th century, demolition crews really do knock Newgate down, and the space will be filled by extensions to the central criminal court, the famous Old Bailey. One solid historical fact is that by 1904 the prison is largely gone, replaced by a newer symbol of legal power. A few people stand at a distance watching. Some are older Londoners who remember the days of public hangings. Their faces are a mix of satisfaction and unease. One man mutters that it is good to see the old horror pulled down. Another says, quietly, that he cannot look without thinking of someone he knew who never came back out of those gates. Memory does not fall as neatly as stone. Pieces of it stay lodged in people long after the walls crumble. Closer to the rubble, boys scramble for fragments. Bricks, bits of carved stone, even rusty nails, all become trophies. That is your quirky detail here. Street law insists that People take home bits of Newgate to keep on mantelpieces or tuck in drawers, tiny relics of a notorious place. Imagine putting a lump of prison wall next to a vase of flowers, telling visitors that it comes from where the worst of London once ended up. It is a strange kind of home decor, part bravado, part morbid pride in living in a city with serious history. Inside, the partly stripped shell, rooms that once held cells and offices stand open to the sky. Sunlight drops into spaces that used to rely on dim lamps. You can picture old corridors now choked with chips of stone, iron bars twisted or stacked in piles, doors leaning against walls without frames. Where there were once careful routines and strict times, there are now ladders, tools, and shouted directions from foremen. The building that spent centuries containing lives has become a temporary workplace, just another contract for a demolition firm. New prisons elsewhere take over its functions. Pentonville, Holloway, and other modern institutions stand ready, more uniform and often cleaner, with different designs and new theories of control. Reformers point to individual cells, better drainage, and education programs as proof that the system is slowly civilizing itself. Historians still argue whether this shift really marks a deep change in how society thinks about punishment or whether it is largely a cosmetic update that keeps the same hard edges in a fresher coat of paint. As you watch the last of the big outer blocks come down, you think about the stories that have rooted themselves into language. Expressions like Newgate frill for the rope around a neck or Newgate bird for a person who has been in prison carry the memory of this place into conversations that may never mention the actual building. Ghost tales flourish, too. People say they see pale figures drifting near the site at night. Here, chains clink in empty corridors or catch the smell of lime wash and sweat where there should only be office dust and ink. Belief in such things is optional, of course, but the fact that people keep inventing them tells you something about how deeply this prison has sunk into the city's imagination. Soon the scaffolding itself starts to vanish. New stone rises in careful patterns. See, lean and sharp-edged. The Old Bailey grows with its own grand facade, and the figure of Lady Justice raising her scales above the street. Trials will continue just across the ground where execution yards and cell blocks once stood. The link between accusation, judgment, and punishment remains physically tight. You might slowly realize that cities rarely erase power, structures completely. They tend to rearrange them in new shapes, leaving old foundations under modern floors. Writers and artists keep coming back to Newgate even after the last brick is carted away. Novels, plays, and later, films and television use it as a symbol for everything from cruel authority to grim justice. Some stories lean into the horror, describing damp cells and merciless warders. Others romanticize clever thieves and tragic poisoners whose names once echoed in these corridors. Historians still argue whether this flood of later portrayals helps people understand what really happened here or whether it smooths the roughest edges into entertaining myths that are too easy to consume. You stand for a while on the pavement that now fronts a newer building. The traffic is different, but the street still feels watchful. Office workers hurry past, gowns swish as barristers step through the doors of the court. Tourists pose for photographs without always knowing what used to occupy this patch of London. Beneath the surface, somewhere under foundations and paving, lie fragments of the old prison mixed with bones that never received headstones with names. The ground remembers even when the walls are gone. As you turn away, you carry with you the sense that Newgate is not just a demolished building, it is a long experiment in fear, control, spectacle, and reform, conducted on real human bodies and minds. Its stones are dust now, its cells empty forever. Yet its shadow stretches into debates about crime and punishment that still run through courtrooms and newspapers. You walk on through the city, feeling that shadow at your back, but also knowing that simply seeing it clearly is one small step toward not repeating its darkest lessons unnoticed. The noise of demolition fades in your imagination, and the streets of London grow softer around you. Afternoon light turns to evening glow on the stone, and the sharp clatter of carts drifts away into a quieter murmur. You picture yourself stepping off the busy pavement and into a calmer lane where footsteps slow and voices drop to a gentle hush. The city that felt so harsh and crowded a moment ago begins to fold itself into something more distant and safe. You let the heavy doors and cold corridors shrink behind you until they are only a memory, like an old photograph folded away in a drawer. The walls that once towered over your thoughts are now just outlines in the dark, fading at the edges. You breathe in long and slow, and this time, the air you imagine is clean, cool, and still. No dust, no smoke, no etching. Keys just quiet somewhere far away. A clock chimes, but the sound is soft now, more like a lullaby than a warning. Each note feels slower than the last, as if time itself is stretching out a blanket for you. You are not standing in a crowd. You are not watching a scaffold. You are not listening for footsteps in a corridor. You are simply resting, wrapped in the safety of your own room, your own bed, your own familiar world. You let your shoulders drop, unclench your jaw, and feel your hands grow heavy and still. The stories stay on the other side of the glass where they cannot reach you. They become shadows on a distant wall, shapes you can put down whenever you choose. Tonight they stay outside while you stay inside, warm and quiet. The last picture you hold is gentle. A calm street under a clear sky. Windows dark. Ning one by one. The city finally settling. You watch that image grow softer and dimmer, like a lantern turned low until it is only the faintest glow behind your closed eyes. You are safe, you are calm, and the past is only a story you can leave for another time.